ADX Florence, silence is not the absence of activity. It is part of the system. Behind thick concrete walls and reinforced steel doors, a prisoner can spend almost the entire day alone, separated not only from the outside world, but from the people living only a few steps away. Hours pass without ordinary conversation. Meals arrive through a slot. Movement happens only when permission is given. Even the smallest routine, standing at the door waiting for recreation, listening for footsteps in the corridor, can become a marker of time. In this place, control does not need to shout. It is built into the walls, the schedule, and the long stretches in which almost nothing changes. ADX Florence was designed for federal prisoners considered exceptionally difficult to manage, dangerous, escape-prone, or disruptive in other institutions. Its most restrictive housing has historically relied on extreme separation. Prisoners may remain in their cells for roughly 22 or more hours a day, with recreation and other movement tightly controlled. The cell becomes bedroom, dining area, bathroom, and private world. Furniture is sparse and fixed. Doors are heavy. Views are limited. Human contact is reduced to brief exchanges with staff, medical personnel, or occasional approved communication. The purpose is security. Reduce opportunities for assault, escape, coordination, and disorder. Then the same design that gives the institution control also creates another reality. When almost every decision is made outside the cell, even minor choices can begin to feel enormous. If you think you could survive this silence, stay with the story. Like the video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments how long you believe a person can live with almost no human contact before the silence begins to change them. A normal day in solitary confinement is not defined by dramatic confrontation. It is defined by repetition. A prisoner wakes inside the same space where he spent the previous day. There is no walk to a communal dining hall in the most restrictive conditions. No crowded yard, no casual conversation across a table. Breakfast arrives at the door. Later there may be a shower or recreation period, depending on the unit, schedule, security status, and institutional rules. Movement is organized, monitored, and limited. The prisoner does not simply decide to step outside. The door opens because the system allows it to open. When it closes again, the concrete room returns. That routine creates a strange relationship with time. In ordinary life, days are divided by work, travel, conversation, noise, and unpredictable events. In extreme isolation, those markers shrink. A meal tray can become a clock. The sound of staff in the corridor can signal a shift change. Recreation can become the main event of the day, even when it takes place alone in a secure enclosure. A legal document, a book, or a scheduled phone call can carry unusual emotional weight because there are so few competing experiences. The outside world continues moving at normal speed. Inside the cell, time can feel both painfully slow and strangely blurred. The pressure is not only boredom, it is the constant loss of ordinary social feedback. Human beings usually understand themselves partly through other people, through expressions, arguments, jokes, touch, interruptions, and routine conversation. In solitary confinement, much of that disappears. A prisoner may go long periods without meaningful face-to-face interaction. For some, the mind adapts by becoming rigid and intensely focused on routine. For others, isolation may deepen anxiety, depression, anger, hopelessness, or other psychological problems. These risks have been raised for years by medical experts, human rights organizations, lawyers, and former prisoners. The effects are not identical for everyone, but the concern becomes more serious when confinement lasts for months or years. Inside ADX, rules also shape survival in ways outsiders may not immediately understand. Cooperation can affect access to privileges and progression. Behavior is observed. Security decisions influence where a prisoner is housed and how much movement is permitted. A seemingly small act, refusing an instruction, damaging property, threatening someone, or violating a rule, can carry consequences that extend beyond the moment. In a highly controlled environment, freedom is measured in narrow increments. More recreation, additional communication, greater contact, or movement to a less restrictive setting can become major goals. The distance between one level of confinement and another may be only a corridor, but psychologically it can feel much larger. There is another pressure that rarely appears in descriptions: anticipation. A prisoner may know that something is scheduled without knowing when the door will open. Footsteps approach, keys move, voices pass, and then continue down the corridor. In a prison, uncertainty is mixed with human activity. In isolation, uncertainty can fill the day, giving small sounds and delays a weight they would carry elsewhere. This is why solitary confinement at ADX cannot be understood simply as a locked door. The real system is a network of restrictions, incentives, observation, and waiting. The prisoner is not only confined by concrete, he is confined by procedure. Every movement has a reason. Every opening of a door has a schedule. Every privilege can have conditions attached to it. For staff, these controls are meant to manage men who may have histories of violence, escape attempts, serious institutional misconduct, or security concerns. For the prisoner, the same controls can make life feel reduced to permission. Permission to move, speak, exercise, communicate, or experience something different from the cell. And beneath that routine lies the question that would eventually become impossible to ignore. What happens when the person behind the door is already mentally ill or begins to deteriorate under prolonged isolation? By 2012, that question had moved beyond criticism and into federal court. 11 prisoners brought a lawsuit challenging the treatment of seriously mentally ill people at ADX. Their allegations would force attention onto a part of the institution the public rarely saw. The issue was no longer only whether isolation could control dangerous prisoners. It was whether the system could recognize when control itself was becoming part of the harm. The lawsuit forced a difficult question into the open. What happens when a prison designed to eliminate risk begins dealing with people whose minds may already be struggling under the weight of isolation? In 2012, 11 prisoners brought a federal class action case against the Bureau of Prisons, later known as Cunningham v. Federal Bureau of Prisons. They alleged that seriously mentally ill men at ADX were not being properly identified, treated, or protected from conditions that could worsen their illness. The case did not challenge the existence of maximum security itself. It challenged what could happen when extreme security and serious psychiatric needs occupied the same narrow space. Inside ADX, security decisions are layered. Prisoners are not all housed under one identical regime, and movement through the institution can depend on classification, conduct, risk, and program status. The Bureau of Prisons has operated a step-down system intended to move eligible prisoners toward less restrictive conditions over time. Progress can mean more out-of-cell activity, greater interaction, or eventual transfer to another federal institution. But progression is not automatic. It depends on reviews and behavior. For a prisoner living under intense restrictions, that structure creates another kind of pressure. Every disciplinary decision can affect not only the present day, but the possibility of a different future. That possibility can become psychologically powerful. In ordinary life, losing a privilege may be temporary and small. In a Supermax environment, a privilege can represent one of the few changes available. A telephone call can mean hearing a familiar voice after long silence. Recreation can mean leaving the cell. Additional interaction can mean being near another person without a solid wall between them. When access is limited, each opportunity gains weight. The institution sees incentives as tools for managing behavior. The prisoner may experience them as fragments of normal life that can be gained, delayed, or lost. The conflict becomes sharper when mental illness enters the system. A person experiencing severe depression, psychosis, paranoia, or another serious condition may not respond to rules in the same way as someone who is psychologically stable. Behavior that appears deliberately defiant can sometimes be connected to illness. Yet prisons still have to respond to threats, disruption, and danger. That is the central difficulty. Staff must maintain order without assuming that every disturbing act is simply misconduct, while mental health professionals must determine whether a prisoner is deteriorating in an environment built first for security. Federal policy began changing as these concerns received greater attention. In 2014, while the Cunningham litigation was still unfolding, the Bureau of Prisons revised its mental health treatment policy. The Department of Justice later described enhanced screening before placement in long-term restrictive housing, additional evaluations for prisoners held there for extended periods, and procedures intended to divert some seriously mentally ill prisoners to other settings. The policy also called for mental health services inside restrictive housing, and greater consideration of psychological conditions during disciplinary decisions. These changes reflected an acknowledgement that isolation could not be managed as a security question alone. The difficulty is that psychological decline is not always dramatic. It can arrive quietly. Sleep patterns can change. Concentration can weaken. A prisoner may withdraw further, become unusually agitated, or stop engaging with routines that once helped organize the day. Some people remain resilient in isolation. Others struggle deeply. Amnesty International's 2014 investigation of federal isolation practices focused heavily on ADX and argued that prolonged solitary confinement could cause severe psychological suffering, particularly for prisoners with mental health problems. The organization criticized conditions it believed crossed international human rights standards, while federal officials maintained that ADX served exceptional security needs. For staff, this creates a constant balance between observation and interpretation. A correctional officer can see whether a prisoner follows an order. A psychologist must try to understand why his behavior changed. Those judgments can influence where the prisoner is housed, what treatment he receives, and whether he remains in a restrictive setting. Federal policy has required mental health evaluations as part of ADX referral and additional review after extended confinement. It also bars the placement of prisoners requiring the highest level of inpatient psychiatric care at ADX, and generally seeks to divert prisoners whose treatment needs cannot be met safely there. But policy on paper does not erase the central tension. ADX exists because some prisoners present security problems that ordinary federal prisons may not be able to manage. Some have committed serious violence inside prison. Others have been considered escape risks or have required extraordinary communication restrictions. The institution cannot simply remove controls whenever confinement becomes difficult. Yet the longer restrictions continue, the more important it becomes to determine whether a prisoner is adapting, deteriorating, or merely learning how to hide what he is experiencing. By 2016, the Cunningham case reached a settlement that required substantial changes involving mental health screening, diagnosis, treatment, suicide prevention, staff training, and conditions of confinement. The agreement also created mechanisms for oversight and strengthened efforts to place seriously mentally ill prisoners in settings designed for treatment. It did not transform ADX into an ordinary prison, and it did not end restrictive housing. Instead, it forced a clearer boundary between security management and psychiatric care, a boundary that had become the center of the legal fight. And that boundary leads to an even darker question. What does prolonged isolation do to a person who enters the cell without a serious mental illness? Because the most troubling possibility is not only that confinement may worsen an existing condition, it is that years of silence, repetition, limited contact, and constant control may change the way a person thinks, feels, and relates to the world beyond the door. The next layer of life at ADX is not simply about surviving a locked cell. It is about what may remain of a person's inner world after the cell has become his normal world. That transformation can happen without noise, violence, or any single moment anyone notices. The deepest cost of solitary confinement is not measured only in hours behind a steel door. It is measured in what happens when isolation becomes normal. When a person spends months or years in an environment where conversation is rare, movement is controlled, and almost every experience is predictable, the outside world can begin to feel distant in ways that are difficult to reverse. The danger is not simply loneliness, it is adaptation. A prisoner may learn how to survive the cell so completely that ordinary life begins to feel unfamiliar. Inside extreme confinement, survival often depends on creating structure where almost none exists naturally. Some prisoners read for hours. Others exercise inside the limited space available. Some write letters, study legal materials, practice religion, or repeat the same routines every day because routine gives shape to time. These habits can become psychological anchors. Without them, the hours can stretch into something harder to manage. A person who once measured life in days, jobs, conversations, and relationships may begin measuring it in meals, recreation periods, mail deliveries, and the sound of doors opening somewhere beyond the cell. That change can seem small from the outside. Inside, it can become everything. The human mind normally depends on stimulation. Faces change, Voices change. Streets, rooms, weather, work, conflict, and unexpected events constantly force the brain to react. In restrictive housing, much of that variation disappears. The environment becomes controlled to remove uncertainty, but in doing so, it can also remove many of the experiences that make ordinary life mentally complex. Researchers and human rights organizations have long warned that prolonged isolation can be associated with anxiety, depression, problems with concentration, hypersensitivity, anger, sleep disruption, and other forms of psychological distress. Not every prisoner reacts in the same way, and not every person experiences the most severe effects. But the longer isolation continues, the harder it becomes to treat time as if it carries no psychological consequence. There is also a contradiction at the center of the system. ADX Florence exists because certain prisoners are considered too dangerous, disruptive, or difficult to manage in less restrictive institutions. Its architecture is designed to prevent attacks, escape, communication, and organized disorder. From that perspective, separation is not accidental. It is the method. But a prison sentence is still experienced by a human mind. That means the same restrictions that can reduce immediate security risks may create longer-term questions about mental stability, rehabilitation, and human contact. The issue is not simple enough to divide into one side that supports security and another that opposes it. Correctional staff must protect other prisoners, employees, and the public. Some men at ADX have histories of serious institutional violence or behavior that made ordinary prison management exceptionally difficult. The danger they may pose cannot be ignored, but neither can the effect of keeping a person alone for extraordinary lengths of time. This tension became one of the most important lessons of the reforms surrounding mental health care at ADX. The legal pressure created by the Cunningham case forced greater attention to screening, diagnosis, treatment, and the placement of prisoners with serious psychiatric conditions. It also strengthened the idea that restrictive housing could not operate in isolation from medical judgment. Security officers could control doors, movement, and behavior. They could not by themselves determine what prolonged isolation was doing inside someone's mind. Even after reforms, the fundamental environment remained severe. ADX did not stop being a Supermax prison. Cells did not suddenly become ordinary living spaces. Movement did not become casual. Security did not disappear. The institution still existed for prisoners considered among the federal system's most difficult to manage. What changed was the recognition that the condition of the person behind the door mattered. That recognition becomes especially important when considering release from extreme isolation. A prisoner may eventually move to a less restrictive unit or another institution. Suddenly, there are more people, more noise, more choices, more movement, more unpredictability. Things that sound like improvements can also feel overwhelming after years in a highly controlled environment. Ordinary social interaction may require adjustment. A crowded room can feel intense. Conversation may become exhausting. Decisions that once seemed simple may feel unfamiliar. This is one of the hidden consequences of adaptation. The skills needed to survive isolation are not always the same skills needed to live around other people. In solitary confinement, emotional withdrawal can be protective. Avoiding conflict can be essential. Repetition can create safety. Silence can become familiar. Outside that environment, however, human life depends on flexibility. People must interpret expressions, tolerate interruption, negotiate relationships, make choices, and respond to uncertainty. The longer someone lives without those demands, the more difficult returning to them may become. There is another cost that concrete walls cannot contain: relationships outside prison. Families grow older. Children become adults. Parents die. Friendships fade. The world changes through technology, culture, politics, and daily life. A person can remain physically alive inside a cell while missing years of change beyond it. Letters and calls can preserve some connection, but they cannot fully replace presence. For the prisoner, this creates a form of distance that punishment statistics cannot easily describe. A sentence may be counted in years. Isolation is often experienced in moments that never return. And that may be the hardest truth about ADX Florence. The prison is often discussed through the names of infamous inmates, security classifications, terrorism cases, organized crime, escape risks, and violence. Those stories attract attention because they are dramatic. But daily life inside extreme confinement is usually the opposite of dramatic. It is repetitive, quiet, controlled. The same walls, the same routines, the same door. That quietness is precisely what makes the system so difficult to understand from outside. There may be no single moment when isolation changes a person, no clear day when the pressure becomes too much. Through thousands of ordinary hours, one missed conversation does not define a life. Neither does one meal eaten alone. But when those moments become months and months become years, the meaning changes. The debate over solitary confinement therefore reaches beyond ADX Florence. It asks how much isolation a government can impose in the name of security, how prisons should treat people who become mentally unwell, and whether extreme control can protect an institution without causing damage that is harder to see. There are no easy answers inside those concrete walls. ADX Florence was built to solve one problem: how to contain prisoners considered too dangerous for ordinary conditions. But decades later, the deeper question remains unresolved. A prison can control where a man walks. It can control when his door opens. It can control who he speaks to. It can control almost everything around him. But when years of silence begin changing the person inside, the most difficult question is no longer how secure the cell is. It is what the cell has taken away. If stories like this matter, subscribe, leave your thoughts below, and remember, sometimes the quietest places hide the heaviest consequences.